Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Lake Forest Club. My name is Larry Kuhl, and I am privileged to be president of the Rotary Club of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff this year. The 70 members of the Rotary Club of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff are professionals, business owners, members of our community who either live or work in Lake Forest or Lake Bluff. Our Rotary Club was established in 1959. We are part of Rotary International, which just celebrated its 109th birthday on February 23rd of this year. We are 1.2 million members in 34,000 clubs in 200 countries, meeting weekly to do good in the world. Rotary started in Chicago in 1905 as the vision of an attorney named Paul Harris, where professionals with diverse backgrounds could exchange ideas, form meaningful lifelong friendships, and take action for good in the world. Rotary's name came from the group's early practice of rotating meetings among offices of each member. Rotary is made up of three parts. At the heart of Rotary is the local club like this one in Lake Forest and Lake Bluff. We are supported by Rotary International worldwide by coordinating global programs, campaigns, and initiatives. The Rotary Foundation uses donations to fund projects by Rotarians and our partners in communities around the world. As a nonprofit, all of the Rotary Foundation funding comes from voluntary contributions made by Rotarians and friends who share our vision of a better world. The Rotary Club of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff also has their own local foundation to help fund important charity projects close to home. Together, Rotary Clubs, Rotary International, and the Rotary Foundation work to make lasting improvements in our local communities and around the world. Our motto is service above self. One example of our service is our ongoing commitment to help eradicate polio in the world. We began our fight against polio in 1979 with a project to immunize 6 million children in the Philippines. Today, after Rotary contributions of more than $1.2 billion and countless volunteer hours to help immunize more than 2 billion children, polio remains in only 2 or 3 countries in the world, down from 125 in 1988. Currently, Rotary is working to raise $35 million per year through 2018 for polio eradication, which will be matched 2-to-1 by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank you for listening to this brief Rotary story this morning. Now I would like to introduce our event chair and past club president, who has worked many hours, days, and weeks to make this economic breakfast a success. Please welcome Tim Newman.
Thank you, President Larry. Good morning, and welcome to the Rotary Club of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, the 15th Economic Breakfast. My name is Tim Newman, and I'm privileged to be the event chair for this year's breakfast. Our Rotary Club is honored to be involved with events like this that help us raise funds to help the community around us. You've just heard from President Larry a little bit about what Rotary is and what Rotary does. We invite members of the community to take a closer look at getting involved with Rotary. It is open to all who both wish to make the world a better place and enjoy the fellowship of other community members. As I mentioned, today's breakfast is our club's primary fundraiser for this year. Funds raised today help us fund charitable activities like our annual Operation Warm coat drive for lesser privileged communities right here in Lake County. The lead charity for today's event is HealthReach, which is Lake County's only free clinic serving the chronically underinsured. With us today is the Executive Director, Nancy Bach. Nancy, please stand. Thank you for being here today. In its 54th year as a community organization, our club has raised over $2 million, which has directly benefited charities like the one you'll find inside the event program book. On your tables today are cards that list our event website, these yellow cards. If you would like to make a contribution to Rotary, please go to that website and click on the donate button. The more money we raise today, the more we can help great organizations like HealthReach. Also in the program book is a description of our event and the speakers and ads by our sponsors. Please take the book home with you and look through it. These are local merchants and professionals who care enough to place ads and help us generate revenues for our causes. Please consider doing business with these organizations. Let me take a moment to acknowledge some significant contribution to today's event. I would like to thank the management and staff of the Lake Forest Club, including General Manager Scott Bruce and Head Waiter Andrew Tillett. The club does a great job of making us feel at home every week and anytime we have a special event like today. I'd also like to thank in particular two members of the Rotary Club who made outsized contributions to today's success. Bob Kenahan owns a printing company and always does a fantastic job in putting together these program books. Every organization that needs printing work should have a member like Bob, whom I've seen complete jobs in amazing timelines. Also, I want to thank Nikki Snoblin, who came up with the website for this event in, I think, about 3 minutes. Thank you, Bob and Nikki. Many others in the club made contributions as well. Thanks to all of you. I want to acknowledge our sponsors today and extend thanks to all of them. They are the real power behind today's fundraising efforts. Gold sponsors, Lake Forest Bank and Trust, Steve Madden and Jack Meyerhoff. Griffith Grant and Lackey, Brad Anderson. Carl Marcion and Schiller, DeCanto and Fleck Law Firm. Silver sponsor, Newman Douglas Associates of Merrill Lynch, Tim Newman and Bill Douglas. Bronze sponsors, Cool Financial Services, Larry Cool. Lesser, Lutry, McGlynn and Howe, Rick Lesser. McDonald, Bainan, Holbert and Berghoff Law Firm, Tom Wetterman. Thanks to all our sponsors and advertisers. All right, I've done all the housekeeping. Now let's get to the program. Today's title is The Fiscal State of Illinois, Fitness or Folly. We've got all the alliteration done for this year. Unless you've been on extended leave on Mars the last few years, you know that the state of Illinois has slowly and inexorably slid from a once proud fiscal tradition, complete with a AAA rating for its debt, to the current condition of frequent downgrades of outstanding debt to near junk status, huge deficits, and underfunded pension obligations. I'll toss in rising state income taxes and being years behind on bill payment. I'm sorry, did I forget a culture in Springfield that many have labeled as outright corruption? More than one governor has visited Club Fed. For even the most casual observer, it looks like an utter train wreck. Thankfully, we always hope cooler heads prevail, and we have three of them here with us today. Let me give you an introduction of all three before we get started. Richard Dye is on the faculty of the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at UIC in Chicago, and also taught economics for 24 years here at Lake Forest College. Carol Portman is president of the Taxpayers Federation of Illinois and is past legal counsel for Sears Holding, Ameritech, and Waste Management. She began her career downtown with McDermott, Will, and Emery. Doug Whitley is president and CEO of the Illinois Chamber of Commerce. He is past president of Ameritech, Illinois, and past director of the Illinois Department of Revenue in a more than 30-year career. What you didn't hear in those remarks about the three speakers today was Democrat or Republican. This panel was chosen to be without political bias, to bring a clear eye to the issues we're going to discuss today. Our moderator is Julian Cruz, joining us for his second economic breakfast. Julian is what WGN calls their roaming street reporter and is best known for his popular traveling series, Cruz in Illinois. He also is a main feature on Morning News. So let's get started. Please welcome our moderator, WGN's own Julian Cruz.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you for the invitation. As a journalist, it's a great opportunity to be here and to learn from these experts and to better be able to do a good job of reporting on some of the fiscal issues facing Illinois. So I have a great interest in being here, but I also appreciate dodging a bullet this morning. I was supposed to go down to cover the governor. They called me last night, and they said they wanted me to go downstate to cover the governor's speech, and so I dodged that bullet and driving through the traffic and the snow and everything, so I'm grateful for that. But I guess my reward is I get to go to City Hall, Chicago City Hall, when I get out of here, so I guess I have to pick my poison. But we're very excited to be here and to be able to listen to these experts and to hear what they have to say, and then we also hope to have an opportunity for questions. So maybe we'll get a chance, if there's enough time, if you have a question in the audience, we can try to get some of that in. But now I believe that our speakers are going to make some brief remarks before we get underway and before we start asking some questions.
Initial remarks. It's a good idea.
Too many microphones in too close a proximity.
Okay, so thanks for having me. It's great to be back to Lake Forest, where I spent so many wonderful years, and to have 3 former students in the audience. Anyhow, Illinois has 2 very serious fiscal problems: a large and growing gap between sustainable revenues and projected spending levels, and the largest in the nation unfunded pension liability. In December 13, the third passed and the 5th signed by the governor, major reforms to pension legislation were passed. Should they survive a constitutional challenge, they will largely solve the second of those problems, the unfunded pension liability. Unfortunately, the pension law changes do not even come close to solving the structural budget deficit problem. For the past 6 years, the Fiscal Futures Project, the University of Illinois Government and Public Affairs, has developed a model for looking at the state's fiscal problems and a technique for projecting the gap in the budget forward. Our measure is broad-based. We have to get past the mischief done when you look just at the general funds, because things are in and out of general funds. So we use a 700 funds measure, which drives some people in my shop crazy. A long-term perspective, the whole thing started because we were concerned with the demographic threat to the state budget and the fact that so many choices were being made to time shift the problems. The popular metaphor, of course, kick the can down the road. How many cans, how many roads? And we focus on sustainable revenue. The Illinois Constitution allows you to count new borrowing and pre-existing fund balances as part of revenue, but those are not sustainable. So we use a measure of the mismatch, of the gap, that takes those 2 out. Our analysis of the state fiscal situation before the pension law change was that there'd be a $4 billion deficit in 2015, growing to about $14 billion in 2025. 4, 14. 10 years, about $1 billion a year of incrementing up. And that comes from projecting, not promising, not expecting, but projecting what's going to happen to spending based on past relationships between spending on certain programs and growth in personal income and that sort of thing. That's serious. I won't go with the metaphors and the whys. People can understand some arithmetic in this particular audience. Now, while the pension law changes were at least touted as helping deal with this large and growing budget deficit, or misunderstood by some people to deal with this structural deficit, they had very little effect in the near term. The savings from the pension law changes on the annual flow of taxes versus spending are all backloaded. Roughly $1 billion a year is allocated to reducing what the state has to pay. And that, if you're going from 4 to 14 billion, what do? You go from 3 to 13 billion. And that's good, but it doesn't solve that second and separable problem of the budget deficit. Now we're faced with certain issues like how. There's a lot of content issues. What spending should be cut? There's what taxes should be increased, or should the tax decrease that is scheduled under the temporary tax hike that is due on January 1st coming, should that be avoided? Should that be delayed in order to get us through? So there's discussion about the content of what's to be cut or what revenues are to be made, but the discussion really isn't focusing on the magnitude of the sustainable deficit, and it's still a significant shortfall. If we kept the higher taxes in place, that alone would not solve the remaining structural deficit problem. The problem is bigger than that. Now, the 3 pillars of the human condition are escape, avoidance, and denial. And what we're seeing right now, especially with an election going, is wanting to say, oh, no. Well, we saw it last night, right? We can balance the budget because of our earnestness and whatever. But you have to demand more. It is not a small problem that waste, fraud, and mismanagement is not a line item in the budget. Yes, there is such in the Illinois budget, but where do you find it, and how do you get a political constituency to deal with it? Anyhow, so we will see where things go, but I come to you saying there is a huge problem in the state which is not addressed, even if the pension law changes survive constitutional muster, which is a big if, even if taxes are left at their current levels, which of course there's lots of discussion and posturing about. Nobody is really talking in serious, meaningful terms about just how much has to be cut and how that would be done. Well, we don't like to tell people bad news, so we don't. Anyhow, I'm Cassandra, and that's all I have to say.
Richard Dye, thank you. Now, the president of the Taxpayers Federation of Illinois, Carol Portman.
I don't really know how to follow all that doom and gloom. Our organization, although we do follow fiscal issues and care a lot about good government and those sorts of things, we are a tax geek group. Our expertise is in the tax area, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about part of what Dick was talking about. There is this budget gap, and whether you use the numbers that the legislature uses, which are, as Dick suggests, perhaps not the real complete picture, or whether you use the bigger numbers that Dick talks about, there's a gap, and how do you fill that gap? And obviously one way is to cut spending, and he's exactly right. Yeah, the governor there was that big Auditor General's report last week about $50 million that got spent somewhere, and nobody really can account for it in any meaningful way. Well, that was $50 million in a one-time thing. Even the legislature's estimate of next fiscal year's budget gap is $2 billion, and that's really just for 6 months. So it takes a lot of 50 millions to get to $2 billion. So you're exactly right. I think that spending alone is going to be difficult to cut quickly. But whether it needs to be done or not, that's not really our call. But I just want to point out that it is unsettling to think that that $2 billion drop, their rough estimates of how they're going to appropriate funds, they're going to cut $1 billion from K-12 education next year. $250 million from higher education, $719 million from human services, $300 million from public safety, and another $144 million from general services. That's their estimate for the next year, what they're going to be cutting in next year's fiscal year's budget that they'll be working on this spring. That's big cuts, and whether you think they should happen or not, they're going to be painful to a lot of people. So then you look at the taxes, the other side, right? There's taxes and there's spending, and if you don't want to cut the spending, you've got to raise the taxes. And one obvious way to do it is just to raise the rates. The temporary tax increase that came back a while back is supposed to roll out, or start rolling back this coming January, a year from now. Don't do it. That's obviously one choice. Just a nice big blunt instrument, keep the rates high. As Dick indicated, that may not be enough, but certainly it would be one way to do it. There's a lot of folks who think that's a terrible idea, but that obviously is a nice big blunt instrument that the legislature can use to fill that hole. The other thing that people talk about a lot is another kind of tinkering with the tax code, but not doing it with quite such a blunt instrument. There's been a lot of debates about the graduated rate, or progressive, or fair, or however you want to call it. Some organizations think it's a great idea, some think it's a terrible idea, but it's certainly filling up a lot of conversations in Springfield and elsewhere, lots of debates, and I know, Doug, your group has come out strongly opposed to the graduated rate for lots of reasons, lots of good reasons. Our organization has not taken a position on that yet, but that's certainly one way to tinker with the tax code, maybe not quite so bluntly as a full-bore rate hike, but making it graduated. What I'm going to talk about a little bit more, though, is other ways to tinker with the code. And some people, like I said, the fair tax is what some people are calling the graduated rate. There's another kind of thinking about fairness, and I'm going to give you a statistic that I hope will make your jaws drop. In Illinois, 2/3 of corporations don't pay income tax. 2/3. Now, I suspect many of you are reaching for your phone and calling your accountant and saying, what the heck? Because I'm paying taxes. And who are all those people, and what loopholes are they driving their trucks through? Or maybe it's my neighbors who are cheating, and I'm going to call the IRS and get them to pay their fair share of taxes. A lot of politicians use that 2/3 statistic. They say 2/3 of corporations don't pay taxes to get people riled up and say, we've got to close loopholes. The politicians don't say why 2/3 don't pay taxes, but they want you to think it's loopholes and it's cheating, fraud. It's somebody, there's something nefarious going on. My corporate experience, tax experience, and our members were telling me anecdotally, at least, they really didn't think that that was the case. And I know that the chamber was having the same kind of conversations among themselves and with their members as well. And so we finally decided to sit down and do a data-driven analysis of what's happening here. So we went to the Department of Revenue and said, give us the last 5 years' worth of data you can on those 2/3 of companies that aren't paying tax. It's true. I mean, that's not a made-up statistic. But tell us about those corporations, line by line on their Illinois tax return. What's going on? How many of them have line 1 number? How many line 2? How many line 3? In the hopes that we could figure out, when do they fall off? When do they start? They started out being taxpayers. When did they stop being taxpayers? So they sent us the data, and we went through the analysis. And I need to back up a little bit. I don't know how many of you do your own tax returns, but in Illinois, like most states, both for individual and corporate income taxes, you start out with the federal. That's where all the heavy lifting is done. You have all your income and then all your expenses, and you get to a bottom line. For corporations, it's called federal taxable income. For individuals, it's called adjusted gross income, or AGI. And that's the number. After all that work is done, then that goes to the top of your Illinois return. And then there's a few Illinois adjustments. And if you're a business that operates in more than one state, you figure out what percentage of your business is in state. And then you come up with an Illinois taxable income. So back to our study. So line 1 is federal taxable income. And we're looking at these 2/3 of corporations that don't pay tax. And these are C corporations, not flow-through S corps that their shareholders are paying. These are C corporations that normally would be taxable at the entity level. On average, $75,000 a year over this 5-year period. 95% of them had 0 or a negative number on line 1. Is it any surprise that they paid no tax? If they're starting out with a negative number, duh, you're not cheating, there's no loopholes, you're not making money. But the politicians don't want you to hear that. They don't want you to know that. They want you to think there's cheating going on out there. And so we've come out with a study. There's a little 2-page summary of it on your tables for you. If you are really interested, there's a nice big fat study on our website, and it's also on the Chamber study website. It's called Probing Beneath the Surface, Understanding Why So Many Corporations Do Not Pay Illinois Corporate Income Tax. And there's a lot of other data in there. The study is thick. Go to page 42. It's where the conclusion is. It's the most interesting. But it's a good reminder that when you're hearing the rhetoric about taxes and about anything, usually people aren't lying when they're telling you the statistic. It's true, 2/3 of corporations don't pay tax. But the question you need to be asking is why? And what's the underneath that before they go tinkering with the tax code? Because what's going to happen is if you raise these proposed loophole closing that typically are being offered up as the solution to that 2/3 don't pay tax problem, all they're going to do is raise taxes on the 1/3 that's already paying tax. So it's an issue that we wanted people to know about, and we're really pleased with the study. That 95% number is fantastic, and I hope you look it up.
So Doug Whitley is going to take over now. Doug, of course, the president and CEO of the Illinois Chamber of Commerce.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to start by saying thanks for inviting me back. I spent a lot of time in Lake Forest and Lake County over the years. It wasn't mentioned, but I do plan to retire from the Illinois Chamber on June 30th. If anybody's got a paying job, let me know. I might be interested in another role. But I've done 13 years with the Chamber. I started out in my public affairs life right out of college wanting to be a lobbyist, so I've been a lobbyist for most of 40 years. I started out with the Taxpayers Federation, spent 15 years in state and local taxes. It comes down to this: who pays and who gets. That's what government's all about: who pays and who gets, and how much can you support. The fact of the matter is that our state government has overpaid and overpromised for years and years and years, and it's finally caught up on it. So I'm going to make some observations for you today, whether you care about them or not. I'm going to share with you. Number one, it's demographics. It's all about demographics, and when you've got as many people on the low end of the economy as we have in our state, you're carrying a lot of human service needs. Many politicians will get up and say, I'm an education legislator, or I'm an education governor. Hey, education hasn't been the #1 expense in state government for many years now. It's health care. And I would tell you that right now, health care is really in a cocked hat. With the new Affordable Care Act and adding people to the Medicaid rolls, and just this morning as I was driving out here, another story in the radio about the fact that the federal government's going to extend health care for another year. I think it's going to take 3 or 4 years at least for this to shake out. When you make major changes, that pipeline to get to resolution is a pretty long pipeline. So healthcare is what's driving the Illinois budget, and we've got troubles there. But the bottom line solution to all of this is jobs, jobs, and jobs. And I will tell you that I think most of our elected officials 20 years ago took their eye off the ball. They thought that there was nothing that they could do that would injure jobs or the economy in the state of Illinois because we're such a great state. And so what they lost sight of was that there are, in fact, this is the governor. There are, in fact, economic consequences to political decisions. And I will tell you that we've driven hundreds of thousands of people out of the state of Illinois because there's greener pastures in other states. There's also needs to be a recognition that it is a competitive environment. We have to pay attention to what's going on around the country and indeed around the world. And there are those consequences that you need to be engaged in. What do I do that creates jobs and brings back activity in Illinois? Now here's my biggest observation. Illinois actually does very well. We are still a great state despite the political headwind. And I think we passed out a document that I wrote a couple of weeks ago, which was a very positive spin on Illinois, and I didn't even touch education. That's another piece. There are lots of wonderful, marvelous things about our state. We have been successful despite our government, despite our political culture, despite the fact that we have more government than any other place in the United States. I mean, we give people a lot of opportunities to serve. Most of that is at the local government level. But as a result of that, we carry a lot of overhead in the process. So my number one component is we've got to get our eye back on the ball, which is how do we create jobs and how do we do two things that are really intangibles. How do we restore confidence in Illinois that this is the place to be, this is a place to do business, I can be successful, I can be prosperous in this state. How do I restore confidence? And the other one is, how do I restore pride in Illinois? And this is the thing that I'm really troubled about our elected officials allowing to slip away. When you travel outside of Illinois, and I know you're all big world travelers, how often do you hesitate to say, I'm from Illinois? Or how often when you have that conversation does somebody make fun of you? I got a letter in the mail just the other day from some guy in Arizona responding to a letter to the editor of the Wall Street Journal that I wrote a few weeks ago. And he said, hey, just keep sending those Illinois people back here to Arizona and let them spend all winter, let them spend their money here. We'll convert them to big, good, solid conservative Republicans because you're failing in Illinois. This was a handwritten letter. But I get that all the time. So I'm not a doom and gloom guy. I've given those negative speeches for years. I'm past that point. The fact of the matter is you can't wring your hands about what's been. Let's talk about what we're going to do going forward. And the number one element of this that I think going forward is the fact of recognition. I think in Illinois we did turn the corner. I think we turned the corner 3 or 4 years ago and I'm going to be partisan on this, when the Democrats have been in power for the state for 12 years in a row and things are really going bad and they're going south and they're worse, and finally they recognized collectively, hey, we're in charge. And we got to do something. Now here's the problem. They're incrementalist. Most of you who run businesses or engaged in businesses, when things go bad, what do? You have a meeting, you say, we got a problem, we're going to fix the problem. If we have to tell our shareholders that we're not going to pay dividends for the next 3 years because we're going to get ahead of this, that's what you do. Got to close facilities, we close facilities. Got to lay people off, we lay people off. It's very fundamental. It's driven by the reality. Government can't operate that way. We will make incremental changes. Yes, there will be pain, but we don't want anybody to really know that we've got trouble. So we've closed facilities in Illinois. We have fewer per capita workers in state government than we've ever had based on the population. We've squeezed some of our budgets, but we're not really ahead of the game yet. And that's the crux of what I think this governor's election is going to be all about. So let me make a few observations for you. Number one, you need to understand this $50 billion budget, about 30-some billion of that is state source revenues, not federal revenues. Four fundamental drivers: health care, public employee pensions, education, and corrections. So I'm going to go out on a limb here. So what are we going to need to do? Number one, we have to control cost of health care. And as I said, right now we're not sure how to do that because of the change both at the federal and the state level. So we did, in fact, the General Assembly did, in fact, say, hey, wait a minute, let's start by just scrubbing the rolls. Let's scrub the rolls and make sure that people who are getting health care actually are eligible for health care benefits. Well, we've actually moved several 100,000 people off the rolls. But after a year, AFSCME sued the state and said, wait a minute, you can't give that to an outside contractor. You got to give that to union employees. And sure enough, now we've stopped. Number two, corrections. We can't put all these people in prison. We can't keep building. We can't keep overflowing. If I were governor, I would call a summit and I would say, Supreme Court, state's attorneys, sheriffs, state police, get in here. We got to do something about mental health and we got to do something about drugs. Now, I'm okay putting people in prison that are problematic. You know, the kinds of guys that run around with guns. But we've got too many people in prison that you and I, as citizens, we really can't afford to house them to the extent that we've done. So I think we need to totally relook at the criminal justice system in the state. It's the fourth biggest driver of our budget. Pensions we did, in fact, go after last year. In fact, we made some changes. There's a two-tier pension system. That first move actually occurred before this last one. Now, the issue is, and we touched on, I don't know whether the Supreme Court's going to hold this up. In two other states that have similar situations to ours, Connecticut and I think it was Arizona, the courts have gone the other way. If the Illinois Supreme Court tells the General Assembly you have overstepped your authority, we're in trouble. We're right back to square one. And that is a huge obligation. And again, perfect example, overpromised. I mean, it's easy to give away benefits. It's not so easy to pay for them. And for years, we gave away benefits. So I would say two things that we need to be conscious of. We are absolutely underfunding our infrastructure in Illinois. Illinois' greatest strength, one of the cornerstones of our economy is where we are located in the country, and transportation is all about being located in the country. So just a couple of little factoids. We have more interstate highways that cross and feed Illinois than any other state. 2/3 of all of the commerce in the nation crosses Illinois. Why is that? Well, they can't drive a truck across Lake Michigan. And we extend almost to Memphis. So the northern 2/3 of this country is coming through Illinois. And so transportation, warehousing, logistics, all of that is very fundamental here. We're the only place where all the railroads come together. Look at O'Hare. You can go anywhere in the world in a single flight. We've got tremendous value because of where we are. But as employers and as business owners, we cannot allow our transportation networks to deteriorate, because when the transportation networks deteriorate, what drives our economy is hurt. And whether it's congestion or fixing the rim of your car because you hit a pothole, you have to be concerned about infrastructure investment and specifically high-cost maintenance of systems that we already own. We have 147,000 miles of roads in Illinois. 147,000. 88% of those are local roads. Of the 147,000, the state of Illinois, the state maintains 9,000 bridges. I don't even know the number for local bridges, but counties and townships and cities and road districts all have responsibilities too. We cannot allow that to deteriorate. The other one is education. Very fundamental role for government is education, and I am seriously concerned that we have begun. In fact, I know we've already gone down the path too far, and we need to take a fresh look at education. In my opinion, we're operating on an educational funding system that's one Band-Aid upon another for the last 20, I think 1995 was the last major change. We should throw it all in the pot and shake it up and start all over again about how we allocate education funding in the state. Those are bold steps, those are radical steps, but you know what? Our situation's so bad we need some grenade throwers. We need to take a fresh look at this. The Band-Aid approach, the incremental approach is not going to get us where we need to go. So let me leave you with a final observation. I'm going to make an assumption that most of you are business people in the room, so here's my point. 140,000 teachers make a political contribution every 2 weeks, and voluntarily, because they belong to a teachers union. And so does AFSCME, and so does SEIU, and so does blah, 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 blah. How many business people are making contributions every 2 weeks to change the political environment in the state of Illinois? We sit back and we wring our hands, and we do a lot of complaining, but we're not necessarily engaged. And I mean dollars engaged. So when a union gives a $100,000 check or a $90,000 check to a single candidate, I can tell you there's not a single business organization in this state that can match that check like that and say, okay, I'll trump you and here's more. We're in this. We want to change. We can't change the thinking. We got to change the thinkers. And it's time that we pressed our elected officials about getting Illinois out of the swamp and get us back to where we rightly deserve to be, a leading state in this country, one that we can be proud of. Now, I'll close with one more observation. I've been doing this for quite a while. There was a time when Illinois had the best Department of Transportation in the country. We had the best Department of Natural Resources in the country. We had the best Commerce Commission in the country. We had the best Department of Revenue in the country, and everybody looked up to our state. Now I ask you, what part of Illinois government are you actually proud of today? In my opinion, you got to be good at something. You need to be the best at something. I don't care what it is, but I want elected officials to tell me this is what we're good at and we're going to be leaders at, and this is why you need to come to Illinois, because we're creating an environment where you can prosper and be successful. That's our challenge, and I'd be happy to take questions when we get to that.
And this winter, you know, one of the stories that we've been following is the impact on roads, and I'm sure you all have seen it driving around. The roads buckling everywhere because of the severe cold, and it's going to extract a tremendous cost. There's no doubt about that. So that adding to the challenges of trying to improve our state. You know, Dick Dye, maybe we'll throw this at you. You know, the Illinois government, is Illinois government trying to fund too much human service for the revenues, or is Illinois not taxing enough to finance the social services that the public or expects? You want to take a crack at that?
I have been working on identifying the gap. I don't know. All I say is that we should have a match between those two. I'm not going to take that big. The people of the state decide what fiscal resources they are going to provide to the state, and then it's the job to balance those with the needs. So I could, as an individual, answer that question. I could, as an individual, balance the state budget. But that's irrelevant. I don't have the political constituency to do so. So anyhow, I won't answer that question as much.
I mean, that is an awful tough issue, you know, the human services, the tremendous need for human services, and what do we do? You know, what do we do? I don't know if Carol wants to take a crack at that question. It is a tough question, or Doug. Anything you want to say? I mean, are we trying to finance too much human services in Illinois?
Spending has grown. The overall state spending has grown. Overall state spending over the last 20 years has grown. Just looking at general funds, which as Dick pointed out is an imprecise measure, but that's the easiest one to use, and I'm lazy, so that's what I've used. I don't have the staff that he does to parse through the seventh. In the 20-year period, general spending has gone up 133%. One of our people ran those numbers for me. That sounds like a lot. That's more than double, 133% in a 20-year period. I think 2012 was the last year they had, because it takes a few while to get data. But how does that compare to the inflation? Inflation has been more like, I think, over that same 20-year period, something like 60%. So you could say, well, our spending, I think, has more than doubled inflation, which maybe would argue our spending has outgrown. Of course, then you could argue we were underspending them before, and we were just catching up. So I mean, back to Dick's point, that is a very personal, visceral answer. But when you're just looking at some of the numbers, our spending has gone up dramatically. Personal income and GDP, the state's domestic product, has been up like 120%. So it's also been ahead of inflation, but not as dramatically as our spending.
So I'll take a quick shot at it. What you need to understand is pensions pushed everything else out. I mean, we're spending about 18% of the state budget. 18% of the state budget on pensions. Most people would suggest to you that the proper percentage ought to be down around 5 or 6. So it pushes dollars away from all the other government services that you would normally expect. And I would argue that the biggest loser in that of recent time has been the education budget, particularly the higher education budget. So the issue, though, comes back to jobs. We have such high unemployment in our state, and we've had high unemployment in our state, not just in short term, but for several years. We have counties with double digit. I mean, take that statewide average. Forget that. We've got counties with huge double-digit unemployment. And when you've got that kind of situation, the human services just begins to hemorrhage out. And you want to deal with trying to help people. So I'm back to the fundamental question. What are you doing to create jobs to get people off the government assistance and self-sustaining? And I'll come back and talk about the city in particular. In the city of Chicago, it's education, it's jobs, and it's drugs. So you got to deal with the fundamentals. Go to the root causes. Not talking about, well, incremental increase this year over last year for budgets. What's the root cause driving our governmental expenses, and what can we do about changing it?
Hey, Carol, you talked about 2/3 of corporations, the issue of paying income taxes. I mean, is there anything that we can do to get corporations to pay their fair share?
That's a loaded question. Oh, this is working. And I guess there's a couple of answers to that. They are paying their fair share. The ones who aren't paying income tax don't have any income. And that doesn't mean they're not paying other types of taxes. Ernst & Young did a study, and a number of groups do studies like this, including our own, but Ernst & Young is a national study talking about what taxes businesses pay. And in Illinois, the year they were looking at, I think, was 2012, fiscal year 2012. In Illinois, businesses pay $30.8 billion in taxes into the state or local government. So just because 2/3 of them don't happen to have any income, that doesn't mean they're not paying sales taxes on their purchases, they're not paying employment taxes when they hire people, they're not paying utility taxes, they're not paying property taxes. We've got one of the highest, as a state, and especially on business property, one of the highest property tax obligations in the country. So that question's a little...
A couple of postscripts. Number one, C Corps really are no longer the preferred model for business operations anymore anyway. I mean, it's limited liability corporations, partnerships, S Corps, because the tax structure is such that you pass the revenue through and you pay as an individual rate. The individual rate in Illinois currently 5% compared to 9.75% for corporations. Duh. In fact, over the last 10 years, there are 8% fewer corporate income tax filers in Illinois than there were before. So the structure is changing. Secondly, just because a company doesn't have taxable income doesn't mean that there's not good things happening. Because what's your fundamental deductions? Payroll, investments, interest. So that means I've got a choice. Do I want to pay taxes on this revenue, or do I want to reinvest this revenue? Would I rather have more people or pay my people better than pay taxes on that? And so a lot of companies make that choice. I'm reinvesting in the business rather than giving money to government. So just because there's a zero taxable liability, I think is really a fallacy and really a false argument that politicians like to play with, but rational people should not.
But Dick, let me see if we can find a question for you that you can sink your teeth into. So these projections that you talked about, I mean, it is sobering. If the overall economy improves, I mean, won't that cure some of the structural deficit? An example, California. Recently California, where they had billions of dollars in deficits, and they've made a dramatic improvement. Their economy, their local economy, has improved. What about Illinois? Any hope?
They've made a dramatic improvement with policy changes, and a better economy helps. The bottom line is we all want a great and vibrant economy. I mean that it will, if we can get past some of these other problems, that's where we need to go and what we need to be thinking about. But the arithmetic for unleash the dogs of capitalism and get this economy moving. The arithmetic, as far as the structural deficit problem is concerned, isn't enough. This model that gave me 10 years out, 14-year structural deficit spending versus sustainable revenues, 14 billion. I let growth be 0.5% higher in every of those 10 years. That's very ambitious, very ambitious. And that moved the out-year deficit from 14 down to 12. So there's revenue to be had from a growing economy, but to wait for that as the only solution to our budget problems is to wait for a cargo cult and to stop gathering while you're doing it.
I think Doug wants to say something.
So Dick, the question I asked for you, that model's based on basically keeping things the way it is right now today. It's not blowing up anything. It's not totally revamping anything. It's saying if we keep doing what we're doing, that structural gap is just going to get greater. So back to my point. You can't keep doing what you're doing. we've got to blow some of this stuff up and start all over again. And the fundamental issue, and people keep talking to me about Texas, Texas, Texas. Texas has almost no human services compared to Illinois. The question is, do they have a heart in Texas? In Illinois, we certainly do, but we're paying for it too. So there is some of the balance. The other issue that is critical to Illinois, and I pay attention to the economics and what's going on with various industry segments. Retail, real estate, and construction are all driven by demographics and population. So those three industry segments are going to continue to suck wind in Illinois until you start getting people moving back in Illinois. They're buying new homes. They want to build new homes. If you're in commercial real estate, you can't fill up those that empty floor or building unless there's businesses that are growing because they need the square footage. And obviously in the construction world, I'll go one step further. In this last recession we've gone through, were it not for public funding, were it not for the tollway, were it not for the Department of Revenue, if it were not for additional federal dollars, our construction industry in this state would be dead. And many companies have already consolidated. Some companies are already doing work in other states because that's where the action is. A lot of that sort of thing is driven by population and demographics. So we've got to get people coming back. I'll give credit for this. Kirk Dillard used it 4 years ago. We need to be a destination economy. We need to find a way to be a destination economy. Now, again, there's some positives on that. What's going on in the inner city, and in Chicago specifically in the tech world, we've turned the corner on that. There's no question that Chicago has become a destination economy. And keep in mind also, we are the capital of the Midwest. Now, this beggar your neighbor stuff between Wisconsin and Indiana, okay, fine, good politics. The fact of the matter is, the biggest part of the Illinois economy, almost 20% of the Illinois economy is the export market, and more companies are going into it. The second biggest part of the Illinois economy is the greater Midwestern region. What goes on in Michigan and Ohio and Indiana and Wisconsin and Missouri is very fundamental to Illinois business because we're selling our product to those states. So I'm not quite into this competition across the state lines, particularly here in the Chicago metropolitan area. We got to be honest. It's Milwaukee to South Bend. It doesn't stop at the state lines. So this whole issue about making Illinois attractive, a lot of it is perception, and we got to find a way to improve the perception.
Now, I want to let everybody know we're going to try to get in a couple of questions. We might have just enough time. We will have a microphone moving around, and if somebody has a question, please wait until the microphone gets to you because we're recording this. We want to get your question.
My question is this. You threw out the concept very quickly about the possibility of graduated income tax in Illinois. What do you see, Doug or Carol, with the General Assembly, either before the election in November or after the election in November, what the chances are of something like that happening?
It ain't about the General Assembly. The General Assembly could put that forward because it's part of their denial strategy. If we say we're for a graduated income tax, even though it will never pass in Illinois a popular vote, it buys the politicians a year of saying we're off for something better. How could anybody, social service lover or hard-headed realist or whatever, how could anybody vote to give more taxing power to an irresponsible process that does not accept the constraints of what revenues are available? Where is your plan? Where is your 5-year plan for getting the budget balanced, getting rid of the unpaid bill backlog, and that sort of thing? Without a real plan, not a trust me, I'm better at getting elected than the other guy, but without a plan, nobody, liberal nor conservative, should vote for a new and open-ended tax in the state. And liberal politicians are for it only because it buys them a year, not because they ever think that people outside this room would vote for it.
Okay, I think, is there another question over here?
Lawyer, I've learned that it's better to copy what somebody else does than to have an original thought. We have 49 other states that face many of the same things we do and handle them differently. Could each panelist please give me two states, each state that does something well that we could adopt? Instead of long answers that say what's happened, what is going to happen? Where's two poster childs that could make it better here?
Good question.
I'll tell you Indiana. I used to think Indiana was a backward state, and Indiana had two governors in a row that got it right. And the first one was a Democrat, O'Bannon, and then followed by Mitch Daniels. And they turned their state around. And part of it is not just the tax side, it's how easy is it to do business? How aggressive is the government about trying to get you permitted and get you licensed and get you up and running quickly, as opposed to Illinois, where it's really burdensome. And so the whole mentality of the state, and I think it was not a partisan issue. The Democrats started it, and they were blessed to have another very positive afterward. People make a difference. People make a difference. And in our state, we've been electing big hair and populists, not CEOs. And in Indiana, they've got people who actually are trying to run the government. And so that would be one that I would pay attention to.
I was thinking about Indiana too. They used to have a number of goofy, what I would call goofy taxes, strange little personal property taxes, and some oddball ways to calculate the income tax. And longer ago than that, it's probably been more like 15 or 20 years. They simplified their tax code. They didn't get rid of the big ones. You can't get rid of the income tax, as much as we all hate it, and property taxes. But they did get rid of some of those goofy, quirky taxes. And I think that is an approach that we should look at, because it would make life simpler. The administrative time that the taxpayers spend on that sort of thing would be very helpful. And you know, one more step in sort of streamlining the government. Customer friendly.
We've got just a little bit more time. I believe there was a question back there.
Yeah, thank you all for your comments this morning. I really appreciate being here and listening to what you had to say. I have a couple follow-up questions for Doug based on what you mentioned. I heard you say mental health and drugs. The mental health is not something that I hear people talk about. It's still kind of one of those taboo topics. So I was wondering if you could expand on that. The second unrelated question, well, maybe it's remotely related, or maybe not at all. You mentioned Band-Aid on Band-Aid for the last 20 years. So how do you juxtapose that or reconcile that with the incrementalism that you talked about in government? I mean,
Okay, so there are two different issues. The first one I was referencing was corrections. The mental health issue, and Tim Dart in Cook County has said it better than anybody else. He said he's running the largest mental health institution in the country. And because we're putting a lot of people behind jail who really should probably be treated differently than as criminals. The second half has to do with education, and this is simply the way politics operates in terms of this incrementalism. So in 1995, we changed the law, fundamentally changed the education funding law, and we were trying to put dollars behind students. Well, if you're a school district that's not getting very much money, what do? You go to Springfield and you say, you know, we need to have a special carve out for, the first one really was special ed. We got so many special ed people, and they're primarily because suburbanites weren't getting any money out of the straight formula, so improving special ed, carve out for special ed helps us. And then a few years ago, we had another special carve out based on property taxes. So we've made these adjustments over and over, but it's all about getting the money. It's not about whether or not the formula works. It's if the formula is not working for me, I'm going to go lobby to try to change the formula to get something. And after a period of years, I think that those Band-Aids or special pots or whatever you want to call it makes for a really confusing distribution process. And it's time to go back and start with a clean whiteboard.
I guess, Doug, you talked about the grenade throwers. We need to not just do the incremental change, but some major change. We're just about out of time. I apologize. I know we're just scratching the surface here. You know, there's so many issues. You know, the pension reform issue is a big one, and recently there was a evaluation on the municipal pension systems that are struggling. A lot of the police and fire pension systems. I mean, is there something any of you would like to say about, I mean, how do we tackle the pension reform? I know that's opening up a can of worms.
Well, local governments have the same problem the state does, but the state dealt with theirs first and kind of kicked the local government one down the road. Now you got the mayor of Chicago talking about needing some help. The reality is local government pensions need to be addressed. There are over 650 pension boards in Illinois for local police and fire. Now, does that really make sense to you? Doesn't make sense to me. We have 7 state pension systems. So there's some legitimate issues about it. Local governments are, when I talk to mayors, they tell me the 2 biggest issues they deal with is workers' comp and police and fire, specifically police and fire pensions that they can't afford because the legislature gives away the benefits, but the municipalities are responsible for paying for them. And that's the way it is. Besides, everybody loves their firemen and their policemen, right? Who wants to go against highly organized, engaged public employees who have a huge self-interest in getting you elected?
Well, once again, we thank you all for taking the time to be here. It's been very interesting, and hopefully we have a little bit more information as, you know, we try to forecast the future, how this is going to affect our businesses if you're a business owner. So we really appreciate the experts taking the time to be up here and talk to us. Thank you very much.
Thanks to everyone who came out today in the March 5th of our endless winter. I had to take a call there from my real estate agent in Scottsdale, but I'm staying. Thanks to our panelists, and thanks to Julian for being here today. Be safe leaving here today. Thank you for being here.